They say the Arizona Territory carves its own justice from rock and bone. But for Rosalind Finch, it was a gilded cage built by her own father. When her conscience became a threat to his burgeoning empire of deceit, he didn't put a bullet in her. He did something crueler. He had the law itself deliver her into the hands of a legend, a phantom of the canyons whispered to be more beast than man, a renegade bounty hunter, known only as Kale. She was a sacrifice, an offering sent to the desert to be erased. But the desert has its own secrets, and the monster she was sent to die by might just be the only man willing to keep her alive. The drawing room of the Finch estate on the outskirts of Redemption Gulch was an island of opulent denial in a sea of territorial dust. Velvet curtains the color of dried blood choked the harsh afternoon sun, and the air thick with the scent of polished mahogany and imported cigar smoke was a stark contrast to the grit and sweat that defined life for everyone else. Rosalind Finch sat before her father, Bartholomew, the crystal glass of lemonade in her hand, feeling as heavy as a blacksmith's hammer. The condensation traced a cold path down her fingers, a chilling premonition of the conversation to come. Bartholomew Finch was not a large man, but he filled a room with the sheer gravity of his ambition. His tailored waistcoat was stretched taut over a prosperous belly, and his eyes, small and sharp, missed nothing. He was the architect of Redemption Gulch, having carved it from nothing, and he considered every soul within it, including his own daughter, a piece on his personal chessboard. "You've been quiet for a week, Rosalind." He began, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. He swirled the amber liquid in his own glass. A daughter's silence is more unsettling than her tears. Rosalind stared at the intricate patterns on the Persian rug. The O'Driscoll boys, all three of them, had been hanged 2 weeks prior. Publicly. Sheriff Brody had stood on the gallows platform, reading the charges of cattle rustling their own cattle, which her father now owned. She had seen the forged bill of sale on his desk the night before the theft was reported. She had seen him meeting with the 2 hard-faced men he'd hired to drive the herd away, only to be discovered in the O'Driscoll's pasture. "I saw the Ledger's father," she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet it cut through the silence like a shard of glass. "I saw the payment to Mr. Ross and Mr. Prentice. I saw the deed you had drawn up for the O'Driscoll's land, dated a month before they were even accused." Bartholomew didn't flinch. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his whiskey. "Business is a complicated affair, sometimes for the good of the community, for progress certain. Arrangements must be made. The O'Driscolls were stagnant. They refused to innovate, to sell. They were holding back the town's potential." "They were holding back your potential," she countered, finally looking up, her blue eyes flashing with a fire he hadn't seen since she was a defiant child. "You murdered them. You used the law as your gallows, and their good name as the rope." He set his glass down with a soft click. "The word murder is so unrefined. I orchestrated a transfer of assets, and you, my dear, will forget what you think you saw. You will continue to attend church socials. You will pour tea for the mayor, and you will eventually marry the banker's son, uniting 2 great fortunes. Your silence is the price of this life I have so generously provided you." A cold dread, colder than the sweating glass in her hand, washed over her. It wasn't just a threat. It was a statement of fact. Her life was forfeit to his will. "And if I don't," she challenged, her voice trembling but firm, "if I go to the territorial marshal, if I tell people what you are—" Bartholomew rose and walked to the window, pulling back the heavy curtain just enough to let a blade of searing sunlight cut across the room. It illuminated the dust motes, dancing in the air, each one a tiny, forgotten world. "Then you would force my hand," he said, his back to her. "And my hand can be regrettably heavy. I cannot afford a scandal. A daughter testifying against her father. It would undo everything. No, that won't do." He turned, and the warmth had completely vanished from his eyes, leaving only cold, hard calculation. "I have made another arrangement for you." Fear, primal and suffocating, seized her. "What have you done?" "I have secured your passage away from these troublesome memories," he said smoothly. "Sheriff Brody will escort you. He believes you are overwrought with grief and require a recuperative journey, a change of scenery." The lie was so blatant, so insulting it stole her breath. Sheriff Brody was a weasel of a man who owed his badge and his salary to her father. An escort with him was a prison sentence. "Where?" she demanded. "To the edge of my influence." Bartholomew said, a cruel, thin smile gracing his lips. "Beyond that, your fate will be in the hands of Providence, or perhaps the locals. I hear the natives in the canyons are not fond of trespassers." The implication was clear. He wasn't just sending her away, he was sending her to die. A death that could be blamed on the wilderness, on renegades, on anyone but him. It was the perfect bloodless solution. His own daughter, a tragic loss, a story to be told with a tear in his eye at the saloon as he bought a round for the house. 2 hours later, Sheriff Brody stood at the door. He wouldn't meet her eyes. His hat was clutched in his hands, and a sheen of sweat beaded on his upper lip, despite the relative cool of the house. He looked like a man delivering a lamb to a slaughterhouse. "Time to go, Miss Finch." He muttered, his gaze fixed on his own dusty boots. Rosalind looked at her father one last time. He stood by the fireplace, a titan in his own home, unmoved. There was no flicker of remorse, no hint of paternal love, only the cold, hard glint of a problem being solved. She had been a cherished daughter, a porcelain doll in his gilded house. Now she was a loose thread in his grand tapestry, and he was snipping it clean. As Brody led her to the waiting buggy, she didn't cry or scream. A strange, chilling calm settled over her. Her father had underestimated her. He thought her a fragile flower, easily crushed. But he had forgotten that even the most delicate flowers in this territory had to grow thorns to survive. The journey away from Redemption Gulch was not an end. It was a beginning. The terror was real, but beneath it, a tiny, hard kernel of resolve began to form. He had sent her into the wilderness to be erased, but she would not simply vanish. She would endure. The ride with Sheriff Brody was a long, suffocating silence. The buggy rattled over sun-baked earth and jagged rock, each jolt a punctuation mark in her life's abrupt end. They traveled east, away from the established trails, and towards the jagged, teeth-like peaks of the Superstition Mountains, a place where maps gave way to legends. The farther they went, the more the pretense of a recuperative journey evaporated, leaving behind the stark, ugly truth. Brody drove the horses hard, his face a mask of grim determination, his fear a palpable scent on the dry air. After a full day's ride, as the sun began to bleed across the western sky in hues of orange and purple, Brody finally pulled the buggy to a halt. They were at the mouth of a narrow, shadowed canyon. The air here was cooler, carrying the scent of pine and damp stone. The silence was absolute, broken only by the tired breathing of the horses and the buzz of a lone cicada. "This is as far as I go," Brody said, his voice raspy. He still wouldn't look at her. He got down and untied her small valise from the back, dropping it in the dust. It contained a change of clothes and a book of poetry, a cruel joke from a life that no longer existed. "You're just going to leave me here?" Rosalind asked, her voice steady despite the frantic hammering of her heart. "My orders are to leave you." He corrected his eyes, scanning the canyon walls nervously. "What happens next ain't my concern." "Whose concern is it? Sheriff who? Did my father pay to make sure I disappear?" Brody flinched. He finally looked at her, and she saw the pathetic conflict in his eyes, a flicker of guilt drowned by a tidal wave of self-preservation. "They say this is his territory. The hunter. Kyle." He spat the name out like it was poison. "Man's a ghost, a renegade. Some say he ain't even fully human. Your father. He figured the problem would solve itself out here. Kyle. The blood hunter." She had heard the name in hushed whispers in town. A savage who hunted men for money, who knew the canyons like the back of his hand, who left no tracks and showed no mercy. Her father hadn't just left her to the elements. He had delivered her to a specific monster. "You're a coward, Brody," she said the words flat and cold. For a moment, something like shame crossed his face. Then it was gone, replaced by a desperate urgency. "Maybe so, Miss Finch, but I'm a living coward." He scrambled back into the buggy, not even daring to look back, as he whipped the horses into a frantic gallop, leaving her alone in a cloud of settling dust. The silence that descended was heavier than before. As the last echo of the buggy faded, the wilderness asserted itself. The wind whispered through the scrub brush, carrying secrets she couldn't comprehend. The shadows deepened, turning familiar rock formations into monstrous shapes. Rosalind stood frozen, clutching her useless valise. Every horror story she had ever heard about the territory flooded her mind. She was prey, and the predator was somewhere out there, watching. She spent the first hour in a state of numbed panic, starting at every sound. A skittering lizard, a hawk's cry, the rustle of leaves, each was the footstep of her executioner. Thirst soon became her most immediate tormentor. Her throat was a desert, her lips cracked. Survival, the most basic instinct, finally overrode her fear. She had to find water. Remembering stories from old trappers, she knew to look for greener vegetation, to follow the low ground. She abandoned her valise, taking only a small shawl, and began to walk deeper into the canyon. The going was treacherous. Her city boots, made for polished floors, slipped on the loose scree, and the hem of her dress tore on thorny bushes. Every step was a battle. Dusk was settling in earnest when she saw it. Not a river, but a dark stain on a rock face, a slow, steady drip of water into a shallow, moss-lined basin. It was the most beautiful sight she had ever seen. She scrambled toward it, falling to her knees and scooping the icy metallic-tasting water into her mouth with cupped hands. She drank until her stomach ached, the simple act of quenching her thirst, a victory that felt monumental. It was as she rested by the small pool, her body trembling with exhaustion and relief, that she realized she was no longer alone. He hadn't made a sound. One moment there was nothing but rock and shadow. The next, he was there standing 20 feet away, a figure born of the twilight. He was tall and lean, built of sinew and desert-cured leather. His dark hair was long held back from his face by a simple band. His features were sharp, angular, as if carved from the canyon rock itself. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were dark and piercingly intelligent, and they watched her with an unnerving stillness, an intensity that was neither hostile nor welcoming. It was simply assessing. He carried a rifle in one hand, held loosely, but with an expert's familiarity. A long knife was sheathed at his belt. This had to be him. Kyle, the blood hunter. Rosalind's blood ran cold. She scrambled backward, her hands scraping against the rough stone. This was it. The monster had come. She expected a cruel sneer, a triumphant growl. She expected the swift, brutal end her father had paid for. Instead, he did nothing. He just watched her, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched thick with tension. He was waiting. But for what? For her to run, to beg, "Are you... Kyle?" She finally managed to ask, her voice a fragile croak. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. "My father. Bartholomew Finch. He sent you to kill me." She said the words, tumbling out in a rush of desperate honesty. She didn't know why she said it. Perhaps to speed the inevitable, to stare her fate in the face. The man's expression didn't change, but something flickered in the depths of his eyes. A curiosity, contempt. He took a step forward, and she flinched, pressing herself against the rock wall. He stopped. He seemed to understand that his presence was a physical force, a weight that pinned her in place. He reached for a leather pouch at his belt. Rosalind squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the flash of a knife, the cold steel. But when nothing happened, she opened them again. He was holding out not a weapon, but a piece of dried meat. Jerky. He tossed it not at her, but onto the flat rock a few feet from her. An offering. Then he spoke, and his voice was not the guttural snarl she'd imagined. It was deep and quiet with a rough, gravelly edge, as if he hadn't used it in some time. "Finch paid the sheriff to leave you. He paid no one else." The meaning of his words slowly penetrated her fear-addled mind. Her father hadn't hired Kyle. He had simply dumped her in the hunter's territory, assuming the man's violent reputation would do the work for free. It was a cheaper, cleaner arrangement, an assumption of savagery. Kyle turned his gaze from her to the darkening canyon entrance. "The desert will kill you by morning. Coyotes, dehydration." He looked back at her, his stare unwavering. "Or you can follow." He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and began to walk away, melting back into the shadows from which he had emerged. He didn't look back to see if she was coming. Rosalind stared at the piece of jerky on the rock. It was a choice, a stark, impossible choice. Stay and face the certain death of the wilderness, or follow a man whose name was synonymous with death, a man who had just offered her food and a path out of the immediate darkness. Her father had sent her to a monster to die. But the monster had just offered her a chance to live. Shaking, she picked up the jerky. Its salty, smoky smell filled her senses. With her last reserve of strength, she pushed herself to her feet and stumbled after the shadow in the canyon. Following Kyle was like chasing a ghost. He moved through the landscape with a silent, fluid grace that was both mesmerizing and terrifying. He didn't seem to walk upon the land so much as be a part of it, his leather-clad form blending seamlessly with rock and shadow. For Rosalind, every step was an agony. Her thin boots offered no protection from the sharp stones, and her lungs burned with the effort of keeping pace. He never seemed to tire his stride long, and even while she stumbled behind a clumsy city creature utterly out of her element. He led her not to a cabin or a tent, but to a place that was barely distinguishable from the surrounding canyon. It was a deep alcove, sheltered by a massive overhang of rock that protected it from the elements. A small, smokeless fire burned in a carefully constructed pit, its flames casting a warm, flickering glow on the stone walls. A bedroll of furs lay on a raised rock ledge, and a few meager possessions, a water skin, some cooking implements, a whetstone were arranged with Spartan neatness. It was less a home and more a lair. Kyle gestured toward the fire with his chin, an unspoken invitation to its warmth. Rosalind sank to the ground near the flames, the heat seeping into her chilled bones. She was exhausted, terrified, and utterly disoriented. But she was alive. She gnawed on the tough piece of jerky he had given her, the flavor, intensely savory, a welcome shock to a system that had expected to be dead. Kyle ignored her. He moved about the small camp with an economy of motion, checking a line of snares she hadn't even noticed, refilling the water skin from a seep in the back of the alcove. He was a man accustomed to solitude, his silence a comfortable cloak he wore with ease. For Rosalind, who had grown up in a house filled with the constant noise of servants' visitors and her father's booming pronouncements, the quiet was a crushing weight. The first days were a silent test. Kyle provided for her basic needs without a word. Each morning, she would find a piece of roasted rabbit or a handful of gathered nuts and berries left for her near the fire. He never handed them to her directly. They simply appeared like offerings from the spirit of the canyon itself. He made no demands, asked no questions, and offered no comfort. His protection was a stark, functional thing. The presence of his fire, the gift of his food, the unspoken promise that the predators of the night would stay away. Rosalind, in turn, tried to make herself useful, to prove she was more than the helpless doll her father had discarded. She tidied the small campsite, gathered firewood, choosing pieces carefully, as she saw him do to minimize smoke, and tried to mend the tears in her dress with a needle and thread from her valise, which Kyle had retrieved on his first morning patrol and left by her sleeping spot without comment. Communication, when it happened, was brutally direct. On the third day, desperate to contribute, she tried to rekindle the fire which had dwindled to embers. She fanned it clumsily, sending a shower of sparks and a plume of smoke into the air. Instantly, Kyle was there. He moved so quickly she didn't see him approach. He stamped out the smoke with his boot and shot her a glare of pure, undiluted fury. "Smoke travels." He bit out the two words, a full-throated condemnation. "Smoke brings men like the sheriff, men like your father." Shame burned in her cheeks. It was a stupid city dweller's mistake, a mistake that could have cost them their lives. She had thought only of her own immediate comfort, not the larger danger. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He grunted a sound of grudging acceptance, and then proceeded to show her without another word how to arrange the wood in a specific crisscross pattern, and use a small leather bellows to breathe life into the embers from below, creating heat with almost no visible smoke. The lesson was silent, efficient, and unforgettable. A strange rhythm began to develop between them. It was a truce built not on words or trust, but on shared space and mutual observation. She watched him tan a hide, with movements that were as precise as a surgeon's, his long fingers surprisingly deft. She watched him read the landscape, his eyes catching the faintest sign, a broken twig, a disturbed pebble, the distant flight of a bird, and interpreting its meaning. He was reading a language she was completely illiterate in. He in turn watched her. She would often look up from the fire to find his dark eyes on her, his expression a frustratingly blank slate. What did he see? A burden, a curiosity, a ghost from a world he had long since abandoned. One evening a storm rolled in. The sky turned a bruised purple, and the wind howled through the canyon, driving sheets of icy rain before it. They huddled deep in the alcove, the fire a lone beacon of defiance against the tempest. The roar of the storm was deafening, making conversation impossible even if they had been inclined to it. A sudden violent gust of wind drove a torrent of rain sideways into their shelter, dousing a corner of Rosalind's thin blanket. She gasped and shivered, pulling the damp wool tighter around her. Without a word, Kyle stood, took his own heavy fur bedroll, and unceremoniously draped it over her shoulders. It was heavy and smelled of wood smoke leather, and the wild, clean scent of the man himself. The warmth was immediate and profound, but it was the gesture itself that stunned her. It was the first act of something that could be interpreted however loosely as kindness. She looked up at him. He was staring out into the storm, his profile stark and grim in the firelight. He had left himself with only a thin blanket. "Thank you," she said, her voice loud enough to be heard over the wind. He didn't look at her, but he gave a short, sharp nod. Later that night, the storm passed, leaving a world washed clean and silent under a canopy of brilliant stars. Rosalind couldn't sleep. She looked over at Kyle. He was sitting with his back against the rock wall, his rifle across his lap, awake and watchful as he always was. He seemed to need less sleep than any man she had ever known. "Why?" she asked into the stillness. He turned his head slowly, his eyes catching the starlight. "Why what? Why are you helping me? You owe me nothing. My kind. We are the ones who put bounties on men like you." "My father," she trailed off the name, leaving a bitter taste in her mouth. Kyle was silent for a long moment, watching the constellations. "Your father threw you away," he said finally, his voice low and even. "He left you for the scavengers. The desert doesn't care what your name is. It takes what's weak, what's alone." He shifted his gaze back to her, and his eyes held a depth she couldn't begin to fathom. "You are not weak, and you are not alone." It wasn't a promise of friendship or an oath of allegiance. It was a simple statement of fact, delivered with the same dispassionate clarity with which he might have described the weather. But for Rosalind, hearing those words in the vast, intimidating emptiness of the Arizona wilderness, it was everything. It was the first brick laid in the foundation of a trust she never thought she would feel again. The truce was no longer just unspoken. It was beginning to find its voice. While Rosalind was learning the hard language of survival, Bartholomew Finch was drowning in the stifling comfort of his own making. The Finch estate was as quiet as a tomb. He had expected relief, a return to the smooth, untroubled operation of his ambitions. Instead, a gnawing unease had taken root in his gut. The silence his daughter left behind was not peaceful. It was accusatory. Every tick of the grandfather clock in the hall seemed to count the seconds of her absence. Every empty room echoed with her phantom footsteps. He had told the town a carefully crafted story. Rosalind, overcome with a nervous disposition and grief for the unfortunate but necessary fate of the O'Driscolls, had been sent to a private sanatorium back east. He accepted condolences with a somber, practiced grace, playing the part of the concerned father to perfection. Most accepted the tale without question. He was Bartholomew Finch, the town's benefactor, its patriarch. His word was gospel. But whispers like desert winds have a way of seeping through the tightest sealed cracks. A prospector returning to town for supplies spoke of finding a woman's valise at the mouth of a canyon deep in the superstitions. A fine leather thing, he'd said, not the sort a body would just leave behind. He'd also seen tracks of a woman's small, useless boots, and beside them the moccasin prints of a single rider. The trail led into the territory of the blood hunter. The story reached Sheriff Brody first. The sheriff, already haunted by his role in Rosalind's disappearance, felt a cold sweat prickle his skin. He went to Finch at once, delivering the news in a hushed, panicked tone in the privacy of Bartholomew's study. "It's just talk, Brody," Finch snapped, pouring himself a whiskey with a hand that was not quite steady. "A prospector's tall tale." "But the valise, Mr. Finch. He described it perfectly. And the tracks. He said the moccasin prints belonged to Cale. Everyone knows his sign. He said it looked like she wasn't dragged. It looked like she was walking with him." The glass stopped halfway to Finch's lips. The image was preposterous. His delicate, refined Rosalind walking willingly with a savage impossible. And yet, the prospector's story had a ring of truth that his own fabricated tale lacked. The problem he thought he had solved by throwing it into the wilderness was not only unsolved, it was now running wild with a man who was the very embodiment of the territory's untamable spirit. If she's alive, Bartholomew mused, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. She's a liability that has grown teeth. She could find her way to another town, to a marshal who isn't on my payroll. She could tell her story. "What do we do?" Brody asked, wringing his hat in his hands. Finch drained his whiskey in one gulp and slammed the glass down. The mask of the grieving father fell away, revealing the cold, ruthless predator beneath. "We correct the oversight. You can't send a sheep to do a wolf's job." He walked to his desk and pulled out a small, heavy pouch of gold coins. He knew exactly who to call: Gideon Ross and Lyle Prentice, the same men he'd hired to frame the O'Driscolls. Ross was the brains, a wiry, cold-eyed man with a scar that twisted his mouth into a permanent sneer. Prentice was the muscle, a hulking brute of a man who communicated primarily in grunts and violence. They were not subtle, but they were brutally effective. He sent Brody to fetch them from the saloon where they spent most of his money. They arrived reeking of cheap whiskey and self-satisfaction. "Gentlemen," Bartholomew began, forgoing any pleasantries, "I have a new task for you. It's a delicate matter of retrieval, or failing that of confirmation." Gideon Ross leaned against the doorframe, picking his teeth with the tip of a knife. "Retrieval of what, Mr. Finch? My daughter." The words felt foul in his mouth. "There is a rumor she is still present in the territory. She has fallen in with the renegade Cale." Prentice let out a low, guttural laugh. The blood hunter heard of him. Spook story, they tell greenhorns. "He is very real," Finch said, his tone sharp as flint. "He is also just a man, and every man can be killed. I want you to ride into his territory. Find my daughter. If she is amenable to returning, bring her back. Quietly." He slid the pouch of gold across the polished desk. It landed with a heavy, final thud. "And if she is not amenable, or if the renegade proves troublesome, I want confirmation that my problem has been permanently solved. No witnesses, no survivors. Erase the entire situation." Ross scooped up the pouch, weighing it in his hand. A slow, cruel smile spread across his scarred face. "For this much gold, Mr. Finch, we can erase the whole damn canyon." "We'd be happy to," Prentice grunted, cracking his massive knuckles. "Always wanted to skin a legend." "One more thing," Finch added, his eyes like chips of ice. "The renegade, make it painful. A message for anyone else who thinks they can interfere with my family or my business." Ross nodded. "Consider the message delivered." As the two men left their heavy boots scuffing the pristine floors, Bartholomew felt a sense of control return. He had unleashed 2 rabid dogs into the wilderness. They would not fail. He poured another whiskey this time, savoring it. The whispers would be silenced, and the proper order of things restored. He had built his world on a foundation of control, and he would burn down the entire territory to protect it. Out in the canyons, his daughter was a loose end, and Gideon Ross and Lyle Prentice were the shears sent to snip her from the mortal coil once and for all. Cale knew they were coming 3 days before they saw the first sign of dust. It wasn't something he saw, but something he felt: a subtle shift in the rhythm of the wilderness. A pair of hawks that usually circled a high ridge were gone. The coyotes had fallen silent at night. The land itself seemed to be holding its breath. "2 riders," he said to Rosalind one morning, his voice flat, He was checking the edge of a knife he had just sharpened. Coming from the east, they ride heavy, not prospectors. Rosalind felt a familiar knot of fear tighten in her stomach. My father. It wasn't a question. Kyle nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon. He heard you were alive. He is not a man who likes loose threads. In the past weeks, Rosalind had changed. The fine lady from the estate was gone, burned away by the sun, and scoured by the hard realities of survival. Her hands were calloused, her face was tanned, and she moved with a newfound purpose. Kyle had taught her to track, to find water, to be silent, and most importantly, to see. She no longer saw a barren wasteland. She saw a world teeming with signs and meaning. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice steady. She trusted his judgment implicitly. "We run," he said without hesitation. "But we choose the ground." Their flight was not a panicked scramble, but a calculated retreat. Kyle led them deeper into the labyrinthine canyons, into a maze of stone and shadow he knew intimately. He moved them at a grueling pace, pushing them to the edge of endurance, always staying one step ahead of their pursuers. He chose paths that left little sign across slick rock and through shallow streams, doubling back on their trail to confuse and delay. Rosalind saw them for the first time from a high ledge. Two riders far below, ants in a vast, sun-drenched amphitheater of rock. One was a large, brutish figure, the other wiry and alert. Even from a distance they radiated a palpable menace. Gideon Ross and Lyle Prentice, the men who had hung the O'Driscolls. They had come to finish the job. "They are trackers," Kyle observed, his voice a low murmur beside her. "The wiry one is good, but he reads the ground. I read the wind." For 2 days they played a deadly game of cat and mouse. Ross was relentless, his skill undeniable. He found their trail time and again, forcing them deeper into the Badlands. The chase was taking its toll. Their water was low, and the constant tension was a physical weight. Kyle finally led them to a place known as the Devil's Jawbone, a narrow pass between two towering sandstone monoliths. It was the only way through the ridge for miles. It was a bottleneck, a trap. "Here," Kyle said, his breathing, even despite their long climb. "We make our stand." He handed Rosalind his spare canteen and a small pouch of nuts. "Stay here. Stay hidden. Do not make a sound, no matter what you hear." His eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something beyond his usual stoicism. A warning. A plea. "Do not come out." She nodded, her throat too tight for words. She scrambled into a narrow crevice in the rock face, a perfect hiding spot that offered a view of the pass below. Kyle didn't build a barricade or set an obvious ambush. Instead, he simply became a part of the landscape. He settled himself behind a cluster of boulders on the far side of the pass, his rifle resting on the rock, virtually invisible. An hour later, Ross and Prentice appeared at the mouth of the pass. They dismounted Ross cautiously, surveying the narrow opening. "Smells like a trap." Prentice grunted, spitting a stream of tobacco juice. "It is." Ross sneered, his eyes scanning the rocks. "The savage is predictable, thinks he can box us in." He drew his pistol. "You go left, I'll go right. Flush him out. I want him alive for a little while." They separated, moving into the pass with their weapons drawn. The silence was absolute. Rosalind held her breath, her heart pounding against her ribs. The first shot came from a place neither man was looking. It wasn't the blast of a rifle, but the sharp crack of Kyle's pistol. It struck the rock wall just above Prentice's head, sending a spray of stone chips into his face. The brute roared in surprise and fired blindly toward the sound. It was the diversion Kyle needed. As Prentice was distracted, Kyle moved. He wasn't where the shot came from. He was suddenly to their right, a blur of motion. He brought the butt of his rifle down hard on the wrist of Prentice's gun hand. There was a sickening crunch of bone, and the pistol clattered to the ground. Prentice howled in pain, clutching his shattered wrist. Ross was faster. He whirled and fired his shot, going wide, as Kyle dove behind a rock. The canyon now echoed with the thunder of gunfire. Ross was pinned down, but he was a cunning fighter, using his cover, effectively firing sporadically to keep Kyle from moving. "He's over there," Ross yelled to his partner. "Get him!" Prentice, mad with pain and rage, drew a massive hunting knife with his good hand and charged toward Kyle's position, his roar of fury echoing off the canyon walls. Rosalind watched in horror. Kyle was occupied with Ross. He wouldn't see the flanking charge in time. The promise she made, the order to stay hidden, evaporated in a surge of adrenaline. She couldn't let him die. She looked around frantically. Her eyes landed on a loose pile of rocks at the edge of her hiding place, a small, precarious landslide waiting to happen. It was directly above the path Prentice was taking. Without a second thought, she put all her weight against the largest key stone. It teetered for a heart-stopping moment, then gave way. The cascade of rocks was not large, but it was enough. The stones clattered down the cliff face, striking Prentice in the legs and back. He stumbled, roaring in frustration, his charge broken. The distraction lasted only a second, but it was the second Kyle needed. He vaulted over his cover, closing the distance to Prentice with astonishing speed. It wasn't a gunfight. It was a brutal, close-quarters struggle. Kyle moved with a lethal grace, dodging a wild slash of the knife and using the man's own momentum against him. He slammed Prentice against the canyon wall, and his own knife flashed once a quick, deadly motion. The big man crumpled to the ground, silent. Ross, seeing his partner fall, made a fatal mistake. He broke cover, trying to get a clear shot at Kyle. Kyle's rifle was already up. The shot was clean final. Ross fell backward without a sound. The silence that returned was more profound than before, broken only by the ringing in Rosalind's ears. It was over. She scrambled down from her hiding place, her legs shaking. Kyle was standing over the bodies, his breathing hard. He turned to her, and his face was a grim mask. But it was his left arm that made her gasp. A dark stain was spreading across his leather sleeve from a wound high on his shoulder. Ross's last shot had found its mark, after all. "I told you to stay hidden," he said, his voice strained with pain. "You'd be dead." She shot back, her fear replaced by a fierce, protective anger. "You can be angry with me later. Right now, you're bleeding." He looked from her determined face to his wound and then back again. A slow, weary expression crossed his features. He had saved her from the wilderness, and now she had just saved him from the men her father had sent. The dynamic between them had shifted irrevocably. He leaned heavily against the rock wall, the hunter suddenly in need of aid. The journey back to their hidden alcove was a slow, agonizing ordeal. Kyle, who normally moved with the tireless grace of a panther, now leaned on Rosalind, his face pale and tight with pain. Every step sent a jolt through his wounded shoulder. The bullet had gone clean through, but he had lost a significant amount of blood, and the desert heat was a merciless enemy. Rosalind, for her part, felt a strength she didn't know she possessed. The terror of the gunfight was replaced by a singular sharp focus she had to get him to safety. She supported his weight, her own smaller frame straining, and guided him through the familiar twists and turns of the canyon, her mind a steel trap of every landmark he had ever pointed out. When they finally reached the shelter of the rock overhang, Kyle collapsed by the fire pit. Rosalind immediately went to work. The past weeks of observation had not been wasted. She knew which plants he crushed to make a poultice to ward off infection, where he kept his cleanest rags, and how to heat water without creating a telltale plume of smoke. With a small knife heated in the fire, she carefully cut away the blood-soaked leather of his shirt. The wound was raw and angry. He gritted his teeth, his knuckles white, but didn't make a sound as she cleaned it as best she could with the precious hot water. Her touch was gentle, but firm, her movements efficient. "My father was a doctor for a time," she said, her voice quiet, filling the tense silence. "Before he decided there was more money in land than in people. He taught me some things. How to stitch a wound." Kyle just grunted, his eyes closed. She applied the crushed herb poultice, the sharp medicinal smell filling the air, and then bound the wound tightly with clean strips of cloth. The work was intimate, forcing a proximity that their silent partnership had never before allowed. She could feel the heat of his skin, see the old faded scars that crisscrossed his back and chest, maps of a life lived on the edge. For 2 days he was weak with fever. Rosalind barely slept. She kept the fire low, dribbled water between his cracked lips, and changed the dressing on his shoulder. She hunted, using the snares he had taught her to set, and managed to catch a scrawny rabbit, which she cooked into a thin broth. She fed it to him by the spoonful, a strange reversal of their roles. He, the silent provider, was now utterly dependent on her. On the 3rd morning, the fever broke. She awoke to find him sitting up his back against the rock, his eyes clear and watchful once more. He looked at the empty bowl by his side, then at her. "You stayed," he said. It was a simple statement, but it held the weight of a question. "You told me I wasn't alone," she replied, meeting his gaze. "I'm not in the habit of abandoning my partners." A long silence settled between them, but it was different from before. It was no longer a silence of caution and unfamiliarity, but one of shared experience. "Those scars," she said softly, gesturing to his chest. "You've done this before. Fought men like them." He looked down at his own body, as if noticing the marks for the first time. "Some were for bounties," he said, his voice raspy. "Outlaws. Killers. The kind the law is too slow or too scared to catch. That is how I earned my name." He paused. "Others were from my own people." Rosalind waited, sensing he had more to say. "I was not born in these canyons." He continued, his gaze distant, fixed on a time and place far from there. "I was of the people of the tall pines. I was to be a war chief. But our leader, he grew bitter. The settlers, the soldiers, they took and took. He decided to raid a settlement. Not for food, not for horses, for blood. There was a family there, a farmer, his wife, their children. They had always traded fairly with us. They were not our enemies." His jaw tightened. "I spoke against it. I said it was an act without honor, that it would only bring more soldiers, more death. For that I was called a coward, a traitor. I refused to ride with them. I stood between the war party and that family's homestead. My own tribe raised their weapons against me." He unconsciously touched a long, thin scar that ran along his ribs. "They left me for dead. The family I protected helped me. Then I left. A man without a tribe is a ghost. I came to these mountains to be left alone. I hunted men who deserved hunting. But I never hunted for a man like your father. For greed." Rosalind finally understood. The blood hunter was a legend created by fear. The man before her was an exile cast out for an act of mercy. He was a protector by nature, driven into a solitary life by a world that didn't understand his code of honor. His story mirrored her own in a strange way. They were both outcasts, betrayed by the very people who should have been their family. "Now you know my story," he said, his eyes returning to her sharp and piercing. "Tell me yours, all of it." Why would a man like Bartholomew Finch want his only daughter dead? And so she told him everything. She told him about the O'Driscolls' kind, hard-working men she'd known since she was a child. She described the forged deeds, the hired guns, the public sham of a trial and hanging. She spoke of her father's insatiable hunger for power, how Redemption Gulch was his personal fiefdom, built on a foundation of intimidation and corruption. She confessed her own guilt, the years of willful blindness to his true nature, living a life of comfort, paid for by the suffering of others. As she spoke, she saw a new light in Cale's eyes. It was no longer just the protective instinct of a solitary man toward a creature in his care. It was the cold, hard glint of a hunter who has found a worthy prey. Her personal tragedy had given him a target that fit his own code. Bartholomew Finch was not just her monster anymore. He was the kind of man Cale was born to hunt. "He will not stop," Kyle said when she had finished. "He will send more men, better men. We cannot stay here forever. Running is not a solution." "Then what is?" Rosalind asked, though she already suspected the answer. Kyle looked toward the west, in the direction of the town she had fled. "A snake is not killed by cutting off its tail. You must go for the head." He met her eyes, his expression grim and resolute. "We stop running. We go back to Redemption Gulch." Traveling only by night, they returned to Redemption Gulch like avenging ghosts. The plan was audacious. Kyle would create a diversion to draw the town's meager law enforcement away, while Rosalind, using her knowledge of the estate, would retrieve her father's secret ledger. As the first hint of dawn touched the sky, a commotion erupted near the livery stable. While Sheriff Brody and others ran toward the sound, Rosalind slipped into the quiet Finch mansion. The house was a silent tomb of memories, but she pushed past them, her focus absolute. In her father's study, she knelt at the fireplace and opened the hidden panel. Behind it was a safe she hadn't known existed. Panic flared, but she fought it down her mind, racing. Thinking of her father's monumental arrogance, she spun the dial to the date the O'Driscolls were hanged, the day his empire was truly cemented. The heavy door clicked open. Inside lay the ledger, its pages filled with the meticulous details of his corruption. Clutching the book, she turned to leave and froze. Her father, Bartholomew Finch, stood in the doorway, a pistol leveled at her heart. "I should have known you were too stubborn to simply die." He hissed, his face a mask of fury. "I'll tell them a savage broke in, and I was forced to kill you both." As he raised the pistol, a shadow detached itself from the curtains behind him. It was Kyle. The diversion had been a ruse. He had followed her, a silent guardian. Before Finch could react, Kyle was on him, forcing the gun skyward. It discharged with a deafening roar, blowing a hole in the ceiling. He easily disarmed the older man, throwing him against his own desk, just as the townspeople roused by the gunshot began to gather outside. "Now," Kyle said, his voice calm in the chaos. "Show them the truth." Rosalind ran from the house and into the growing crowd. She held the ledger high for all to see. "My father is a murderer!" she cried, her voice ringing with unshakable conviction. He had the O'Driscolls framed and hanged for their land. The proof is all here. She read the damning entries aloud, and a horrified silence fell over the crowd, quickly replaced by a low growl of anger. As Kyle pushed a defeated Bartholomew out the door, the townspeople surged forward, their fear finally eclipsed by their fury. His empire of lies had crumbled. Amid the chaos, Rosalind looked for Kyle, but he was already gone. His work was done. He had slipped away as quietly as he had arrived, a lone figure melting back toward the mountains and his solitary freedom. She watched the horizon where he had disappeared, the ledger in her hand, and a new, uncertain future for Redemption Gulch resting squarely on her shoulders. That's where our story ends, not with a neat little bow, but with the dawn of a new, uncertain day. Rosalind, armed with the truth, faced the monumental task of rebuilding a community poisoned by her father's greed. Kyle walked back into the wilderness, a solitary guardian who had tipped the scales of justice before melting back into legend. Their paths diverged, but their story became a testament to the fact that even in the most brutal of landscapes, courage can be found in the most unexpected places. It reminds us that monsters often wear tailored suits, and saviors can be the outcasts society has thrown away. If this story of survival betrayal and unlikely alliances captured your imagination, please let us know by hitting that like button. Share it with someone who loves a classic tale of the Wild West. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel and ring that bell for more stories that dig deep into the grit and glory of the American frontier. What do you think happened to Rosalind and Kyle? Let us know in the comments below.